Our third presenter this evening is Professor Kevin McCracken from Macquarie University. Now, interestingly, I referred to a moment ago that in 1792, when Governor Phillip left the colony, as it was then called, he established a farm at the Field of Mars. In the late 1960s, the Field of Mars was handed over to Macquarie University. And in that process, 109 farms were displaced, and we, with a little bit of work, calculated that the major tenants of the time were 59 immigrant Italian families who probably made a lot of money but regretted leaving. Like Pauline, Kevin is overseas born in New Zealand, educated at the University of Otago, before undertaking his PhD at the University of Alberta in Canada. Kevin joined Macquarie University in 1973, where he taught me population geography and did lots of other things, I'm sure, before rising to become the university's Dean of Environmental and Life Sciences. Kevin is now Honorary Fellow at Macquarie and also Honorary Professor at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. He shortly will release another book called Global Health, which he co-authors with a colleague at Lingnan, and that'll be released by Routledge, an esteemed British publisher. Like all of our panellists, Kevin is a frequent contributor to public debate and a well-known columnist in Australia and New Zealand newspapers. So please welcome Kevin McCracken.
Thank you, Phil. You make me feel ancient.
Me too.
One of the disadvantages of being the third and last speaker on an occasion like this is a lot of the points that you were going to introduce are already being introduced, and Glenn and Pauline have certainly done that. In fact, Pauline and I have even doubled up on a couple of slides, and there were no prior phone calls between us about this. Anyway, I'm going to ignore that and take that as an advantage. We must all be right, and so it's sort of reinforcement learning if you get some of the same things here. As most of you here tonight would know, we're in the middle at the moment of a national debate on our population future, where we're likely heading population-wise. Should we be going in this or that direction? What are the benefits and costs of different population futures? This debate, its latest manifestation anyway, essentially stems from comments by former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry and former PM Kevin Rudd back in late 2009. Dr. Henry expressing concern at that time about Australia's ability to sustain a projected 60% growth in population over the coming 4 decades, while PM Rudd stated he believed in a big Australia and made no apology for a pro-population growth policy. Like Glenn said, I see this debate as a good thing, as population has implications for all aspects of life: the economy, society, communities, the environment. And a pleasing aspect, I think, of the current debate is that population is being discussed in a holistic way: size and growth, fertility, immigration, internal migration, geographic distribution, age composition, ethnicity, health, labour force, education, households, housing, environment. All of these things are being discussed. Many times in the past, when population has been put under the microscope, the debate has been fairly narrow, often focused on just one aspect of population, most usually immigration, occasionally fertility and or population ageing. And there have been some exceptions, the Bowery report back in the 70s and that population summit that Glenn spoke about too took on a wider perspective. Anyway, with those words of context, let me move on to talk about our future population. Almost certainly, as we've heard from Glenn and Pauline tonight, we're all sitting here tonight looking at the prospect of a significantly larger population by mid-century. But there is no certainty at all as regards exactly how much larger that population will be. We see and hear a lot in the media about how Australia's population will be X million in such and such a year, i.e. a population forecast. But forecasting populations, as Pauline said, is a dangerous exercise. To be blunt, the future population is unknowable as it depends on so many variables, and so you should always be wary of such pronouncements. Population specialists prefer to talk in terms of projections. These are what I call what-if statements, that what the population would be if future assumptions or assumptions about future trends in fertility, mortality and migration were to prove correct. Let me show you some recent population projections for Australia. The first slide here are the latest ABS projections published in 2008. I was a little bit surprised, in fact, to find that they were the latest. I was expecting to find something a wee bit more up to date. No doubt they're in the works at the moment, but these are the official ABS publications in that. Now, if I just move on to the next slide, what I've termed a moving feast, population projections for Australia, giving you a look at a wider range of things here. The ABS ones that I had on the previous slide and an earlier publication from the ABS, but also some from CSIRO, the Treasury intergenerational reports that Glenn referred to, and also some recent work by the Centre for Independent Studies. As you can see, the projected numbers have risen substantially in the last few years, starting in this table here with the second intergenerational report published in 2007. For the actual numbers at mid-century, however, we'll have to wait until then, until 2050 comes around, as a lot could happen in the meantime. For example, a severe, prolonged global economic depression could slow down growth dramatically. Large, abrupt climate change could be another game changer. My best guess, however, is that by the middle of this century, our population will indeed be somewhere in the mid-30 millions, at least 10 to 12 million more than they've got today. So it's going to be a very different Australia from the one we currently live in. One point I just wanted to draw your attention to before moving on is that a lot of people think we could stop our population growth immediately if we switched off the immigration tap. The slide here shows that that is not the case. There's such a thing as population momentum built into our population through our age structure, and so even if we were to turn off the immigration switch, our population would go on growing, as you can see there in that graph from the Centre for Independent Studies. Okay, well, some features of the population, as I said. Obviously a larger population, an older population. I agree totally with Pauline on a large expansion of the capital cities. Sydney's going to be, if not at 7 million, so close to it that it doesn't matter. Melbourne's going to be up there in the same area and the like. So massive growth of our capital cities. There's probably going to be a lot of talk over the coming decades about regional development, regional population growth. I don't think it will really add up or produce very much, because I think people will go where the job opportunities are, and that almost inevitably will be in the major cities or near to them. I think the coastal zone concentration will intensify, and as Pauline says, household size I think will continue to fall, and household numbers will increase at a greater rate than population itself, and there are major implications in there for housing in particular. Can Australia sustainably handle that population growth and change? Well, it's certainly going to pose a lot of challenges. Threats to the natural environment, demands on water supply, implications for food production, housing supply, infrastructure growth, implications for the quality of our life, for our social cohesion and the like. I obviously can't cover all of those things here tonight, and in fact a lot of them are areas I'm not even competent to comment on. But I will try and make some comments that will hopefully be informative and give you cause to think. The first point I'd like to make is the need to avoid seeing population numbers, population growth, as automatically an environmental or some other sort of problem or villain. I'd argue that not all the problems placed at the door of population are in fact fair calls. Just let me take some of Sydney's environmental and urban problems as a quick example. Such things as traffic congestion, water quality, water supply, habitat and biodiversity loss and the like. It's not Sydney's 4.5 million plus strong and growing population that causes all these problems per se. Population numbers obviously have an impact, but other factors are also responsible. And I'd put it down, or summarise it in terms of the way we do things, our addiction to private motor vehicles and our concomitant dislike or disdain for public transport and our underdevelopment of it. The ongoing love many of us have for big houses on big lots, producing a very sprawling urban form. The disconnect between residential and job location that Pauline talked about, necessitating lengthy commuting for a large proportion of the population. We have a very spatially inefficient city form. The wasteful way we use water, the underpricing of it, our reluctance to introduce tertiary treatment of sewerage to improve water quality. The technology's there, the will isn't. Now, one way of sort of summarising what I'm talking about there is to move on to my next slide with a simple little formula there that I used to use in my population classes at Macquarie, because I think it's a useful way of summarising what I'm talking about here. It's looking at impact, environmental impact, impacts in cities, and what produces it. And what this little formula is trying to say is it's not just population. The P is in there, the P for population, but there are a lot of other things, important things. Lifestyle, the organisational style of our society, technology and the like. So I'd like you to keep thinking of population, okay, as a factor, as a player, as a driver, as a problem at times, but it's not the whole villain of the piece. That formula is a good lead-in to the question of whether the large future population numbers being tossed around today could be ecologically sustained. Could the Australian continent sustainably carry 35 or 36 million, maybe 50 million, or perhaps even more? The central principle of the notion of sustainability, in my eyes at least, is comfortably living within the biocapacity of the environment. And by biocapacity, I mean the capacity of ecosystems to produce biological materials useful for us and to absorb the waste that we generate, and that's based on current management schemes and extraction technologies and the like. Also explicit in the concept of sustainability, as I said, is the notion of intergenerational equity, in a sense not to steal from your grandchildren and your grandchildren, not to use up all the resources now, not to do significant environmental damage and the like. How close a population is coming to operating, how close population is operating to the biocapacity at a given time is indicated by its so-called ecological footprint, a term that I'm sure most of you in the audience have heard about. This is an estimate of how much biologically productive land and water area the population requires to produce all the resources it consumes and to absorb the waste it generates. So a population's ecological footprint, thus, is its demand on nature. Biocapacity is nature's capacity to meet this demand. The larger the footprint, the more demanding that population is per person on natural resources and the capacity of the environment to cope with waste products. Measuring both of these things, biological capacity and ecological footprints, I think is very, very difficult, and I'd say, in fact, somewhat rubbery, but nonetheless useful in an indicative sense. As we all know, Australia is an affluent, high-consuming nation, and therefore, not surprisingly, we come out with one of the heaviest footprints in the world. Just in the case of CO2 emissions, I saw just the other day 2009 figures released, and just in terms of absolute amount that we released, we were the 15th highest country in the world. In terms of per capita CO2 emissions, we rate about 9th. So we are, a heavy footprint nation in that regard. What I've done in the next few slides is just to give you some insights into aspects of our ecological footprint. These are figures produced by an organisation called the Global Footprint Network, and that linkage there will get you through to their website and provide a lot of interesting material for you on how the footprint idea has been operationalised and the like. As you can see there, Australia in red shows up as being one of the leading nations in that regard. The components of our ecological footprint, based on how this global footprint network calculate the index, our carbon footprint is the main contributor there, with other agricultural and other land uses coming through there. Just moving on to the next slide, a map of New South Wales showing Sydney's ecological footprint taken from the Metro Strategy, the 2005 version of it, showing how the actual urban footprint of Sydney, the actual land use thing is very small, but when you look at the amount of land and water that we need to really support ourselves here, we're using up pretty close to 45% of the state, and that if present trends were to continue by about, I think 2031, we'd be using virtually all of the state. From the latest New South Wales State of the Environment report, just a little graph there looking at the ecological footprint for Sydney and for New South Wales as a whole, and a short period of there, but showing change over time, and the footprint in a sense going in the wrong direction, the impact becoming heavier and heavier. Some environmentalists, and Tim Flannery, who was mentioned by Glenn, and who is a former colleague in our division at Macquarie, would probably argue that Australia is already overpopulated from a sustainability point of view. I don't, however, agree with that. I think the slide we've got up here now, this is slide number 11, which is looking at biocapacity and ecological footprint trends for Australia over a number of years, suggests that a population of 35 to 36 million would be sustainable at current footprint levels, and in fact I'd say could take even a bit more. If you go back to slide 5, that was my little formula, PLOT, the factors influence impact. If you were to get into that formula and reduce the per capita impact of, or lighten the per capita footprint by reducing consumption, by reducing waste, improving production and management, you'd theoretically make it possible to hold a lot more people on this continent. Having said that, I'd next say that whether that larger size would be a good idea, however, is a totally different question. You know, you'd have to ask yourself, what would be the benefits? What would be the costs of that pathway of a far larger population, and for whom? I think that's really important. For whom? The community as a whole, or just some sectional interests, some sectional groups in the community? My personal leaning is towards the precautionary principle. I don't press too close to environmental limits, allow for some breathing space, and I'll come back to that later if I have a little bit of time. What I'd like to do now is very briefly turn to the critical issues of food production and water supplies in relation to our projected population growth. Would we be able to produce enough food for a far larger population? Would our water supplies be sufficient to support 35 million, 50 million, or even more? I need to preface these comments with the disclaimer that I'm not an expert in either agriculture or hydrology, so to that extent I'm dependent on the work of other researchers. However, I do believe from reading round on these issues that the answer to both questions is yes. In the case of food production, according to the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Resource Economics and Sciences, in a report they put out last year, we currently produce about twice as much food as we consume. Though, again, whether we do this in the most ecologically sustainable manner is another question. On simple current production numbers then, we could quite comfortably feed a considerably larger population than we have at present. Exactly how much larger, again, is very difficult to say. That depends on future trends in agricultural productivity, and that's not an easy thing to project. What ABARES does tell us is that the rate of growth in agricultural productivity in Australia currently is declining as R&D development has declined, so that's sort of a worrying note. The CSIRO Future Dilemmas study that I put up on screen in the second or third slide on population projections, that's well worth looking at, that study. Even though it was done 10 years ago, I think it's still well worth looking at. It argues that, quote, barring unforeseen catastrophes, Australia has enough land, water and energy to provide food for all its citizens out until 2100. And at 2100 in their projections, they were looking at a high population projection of 50 million. The possible downside of this, of course, is that feeding the larger population may mean less food is available for export, and then we have the trade balance, the economic losses, implications that would flow from that. I had a section on here on water supplies, but as Pauline has spoken about it, I'll skip over that. In fact, as I said, we shared slides there. I found the same report that she did from the Water Services Association of Australia, and while perhaps got to be slightly wary, it is an industry group and things like this, I found a very interesting report on implications of population growth here in Australia. And as Pauline told us, sort of using the ABS medium series population projections, and factoring in all the things that they see as driving water demand, they're projecting a 76% increase in urban water consumption over the period up until I think 2056 was the date that they used there. That's an enormous challenge. But they do believe it can be done in a couple of ways. First of all, as Pauline said, sort of developing a diverse portfolio of water supply options. Dams, yes. Recycled water, yes. Dare I say it, desalination, rainwater tanks, rural to water, urban water trading, stormwater harvesting and the like. And alongside these things, sort of sophisticated water efficiency strategies, better, more efficient appliances, restrictions on water use, sort of perhaps more realistic pricing of the cost of water and the like. So the consensus, at least, of that body seems to be that they think that that large population increase can be met, and also recent studies by the Centre for Independent Studies, I think a report entitled Droughts and Flooding Rains does come to the same conclusion. And if you go back to the CSIRO Future Dilemmas thing, essentially they say it can be done, but it's not easy. What I would add in here is that more rapid and larger climate change that is currently anticipated could, of course, change all of this. And that's a good point. Having brought up climate change, it's a good point to return to the precautionary principle I mentioned earlier, because in the forefront of my mind, when I use that term, I did have climate change up there, the possible effect of climate change on population sustainability via its impacts on water supplies and, of course, on agricultural production. I won't talk about water supplies again because Pauline has covered it, but just a few comments on the agricultural side of it. Before I do that, draw your attention to an interesting joint report from CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology called State of the Climate. You Google that, you can get it. A report released earlier this month and bringing together data from the Bureau of Meteorology's records there. And showing there that since 1960 the mean temperature in Australia has increased significantly over the past half century. Rainfall has decreased across much of southern and eastern Australia, including all of the major production centres. The last page of the report is worth looking at. It's headed up what this means. What it means is that Australia will be hotter in coming decades, according to the Bureau, and much of Australia will be drier in coming decades. And for the naysayers, it included in another point, climate change is real. Just in terms of food production, the impact of climate change on agriculture and food security is likely to be major. In fact, the Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council has listed vulnerability to climate change and climate variability as the leading major challenge facing Australia's food security. Such things as higher temperatures, changes in rainfall, distribution and variability, longer and perhaps more frequent droughts, increased evaporative water loss, more frequent severe weather events, go on and on and on, are all likely to reduce agricultural production through damaging crops, through stressing livestock, through reducing the quantity and quality of pastures. Wheat, our major food and export crop, is especially sensitive to climatic influences, and so climate change alongside large population increase could really cut into the wheat crop and our ability to export to the world. Currently about 75 to 80% of our wheat is exported, and it's an important component in global food security, so it's a point to bear in mind that all Australian population type issues just aren't domestic, they do have international ramifications. Just in the final part of this, in wrapping up, I did want to move to a totally different area of sustainability, and that was the one of housing demand and supply. Unfortunately, my good friend Pauline here has relieved me of some of the responsibility for doing that. But just what I'd like to say is, if you look at the latest report from the National Housing Supply Council, that was a council set up 3 or 4 years ago by the Treasurer and the Minister for Housing to monitor housing supply and demand and affordability, we already have a shortage of over 200,000 dwellings. If you do the maths and turn that into population figures, that's basically the equivalent of housing for all the people in Tassie, all the people in Tasmania, and a few more on top of that. In turn, this shortage is most pronounced at the more affordable end of the housing market and in the social housing market. Now, the housing construction stimulated by population growth is claimed by pro-growth advocates as one of the main economic benefits of the big Australia push. However, there have to be, I think, serious doubts about the capacity to meet the underlying demand of a 50% or more population increase by mid-century. As Pauline said, household numbers are increasing more rapidly than population itself. The growth in household numbers is expected to be about 1.6% per year over the period now until mid-century. Population growth is, according to the ABS projections, is anticipated to be about 1.3%. So it's not just population numbers, it's changes in the composition of the population. As you can see in this last slide, by 2030, the Housing Council is suggesting that we can perhaps have a housing shortage here in Australia of over 600,000. Again, if you translate that into population terms, it's about 1.5, 1.6 million people. That's the current size of Perth, so that could be the housing shortage that we're looking at. Also, the greatest unmet demand would almost certainly be at that lower, more affordable end, the social housing end of things, with the attendant costs of further entrenching social disadvantage among low-income groups, some Indigenous groups, some migrant groups and the like. And I think a threat not just of greater disadvantage, but also threatening social cohesion. Another different side of the housing challenge is, where will the extra dwelling stock go? As Pauline says, the capital cities will almost certainly be the main locations, and within them, infill within existing areas is likely to be the main form of development. Certainly, if you look at the latest metro strategy for Sydney, the one released back in 2010, it aims for at least 70% of that 700,000 plus new houses to be located in existing suburbs, and up to 30% in greenfield areas. Both approaches, infill or greenfield development, pose problems, environmental problems, problems of quality of life, social cohesion and the like. So I think that, as Pauline said, is one of the really major challenges facing us. To conclude, although I have some concerns, on balance, I believe Australia could sustainably support a considerably larger population. Having said that, though, I'm not sure whether it would necessarily be a better Australia. And I also keep telling myself not to forget the population ratchet effect. That is, once the 35 to 36 million or 50 million mark is clocked up. There's no easy way of going back to a smaller population if you want to. Populations can shrink, as Glenn told us, and the examples of Japan and Russia at the moment. Populations can shrink, but that demographic path is a painful process. Thank you.